In the second panel, we'll be thinking together through the issue of inequality with emphasis on migration crisis in many parts of the world, including Central America, and on human rights challenges worldwide. Let me mention about the format of this panel. We've got two speakers, Professors Cecilia Menjivar and Amanda Murdy, who will address migration crisis and human rights challenges for about 25 to 30 minutes each. And then we'll move on to two designated discussions by Professor Emily Liu and Wonbin Cho. It will leave for about 10 minutes, I guess, for the conversation among the participants toward the end. We'll be ending at 12:40 p.m. in Korean time. You wouldn't be familiar with that? Sharp. Let me first introduce Professor Cecilia Menjivar. Cecilia Menjivar is a professor of sociology and chair at the University of California at Los Angeles. She's currently the president of the American Sociological Association. Her research focuses on the structural roots of inequalities with the case of international migration. The title for her talk is Migration, Upheavals, States and Policy Responses. Cecilia, I'll let you take it from here. You might want to share your slide now, and you've got 25 to 30 minutes. Please.
Thank you.
Please welcome
Thank
Cecilia.
You very much for the introduction, and I am going to get right into my presentation so we have a good amount of time for this discussion. Okay. You see the title page well?
Yes.
Okay. All right. In this invitation to speak about and to reflect about upheavals that we see around the world, I was thinking of everything that is going on around us today: climate change, increased inequality and social-political polarization, threats to democracy, distrust in science and scientific knowledge and attack on this, and of course, migration, population, and population displacement. Very often, all of these are interrelated, and knowing that and acknowledging that, I'm going to focus on migration and population displacement. We see population displacements all over the world these days, in all corners of the world, from Australia to the Middle East, Europe, throughout the Americas. We see that everywhere, and we receive that those images through. We receive we are exposed to these population displacements mostly through images of people trying to line up to enter a border, trying to cross oceans to enter their destination. And we may say that we live in an era characterized by migration crisis. I put it in quotes because crises are framed very often in that way. And I'm going to come back to this later in the presentation. So we get images of people trying to enter their destination, desperately trying to enter their destination, fleeing conditions of upheaval, fleeing conditions of multiple forms of violence, and trying to reach their destination. At the receiving end, they are often met with ever-tightening border security by land and by sea, with borders that continue to expand to encompass ever more transit countries, buffer zones, and adjacent spaces, with the purpose of stopping migrants from reaching their desired destinations. And this is not a new phenomenon, of course. As David Fitzgerald points out in his book, Refuge Beyond Reach, this has been happening for most of the 20th century, where wealthy nations have been trying to keep most of the people who reach their borders or who don't even reach their borders out in seeking protection, seeking humanitarian protection. And so this is not new. What I think is new today, especially as we see the response from the part of the wealthy nations, is the use of technology and networks, expansive networks that connect the receiving countries through methods of surveillance and through methods of enforcement. So technology has really become central in these efforts to expand borders beyond the physical demarcation of the wealthy nations. And so as you hear me talk here, you may, the one actor may start to become visible, and that is the state. And so today I want to emphasize the role aiding, sustaining, framing migration crisis that we only see through the faces of anguished people escaping violence. The state is a major key actor in all the migration crisis we see today. As Steve Gold and Stephanie Nouwen note, the existence of states underlies the very category of international migrants. For there to be international migrants, there needs to be state power bounded within a certain geography and a state apparatus that allocates or denies migrant rights. So I want to shed light specifically on the role of the state and turn the lens to this actor away from the people who are seeking to migrate and exit their countries and seek need of protection. And as I mentioned, as I pay attention and I bring your attention to the state, there are a couple of points I want to make. First, I don't mean to present the state as a homogeneous entity, because agencies within the state, different bureaucracies, may have different goals, and sometimes those agencies and those bureaucracies within the state may sometimes act at cross purposes. Also, when I mention the state, as you will see in a moment, I'm not referring only to the receiving state. I'm talking about the role of the sending, the transit, and the receiving state in this, in playing a role in this, in population displacements and migration. And I want to emphasize the collaborations across sending, transit, and receiving states, because this is key to the role that I'm trying to highlight in this process. So I'm going to start with the role of the sending state. And I will focus a little bit, at least, on Central America, because that's the area I focus my research on. But I want you to think of other states as well, other sending states, as I mentioned. I described the conditions that the sending states create for people to want to exit. So, for instance, the sending state institutes policies that create conditions for exit, such as economic policies that don't protect the interests of the majority of the population and continue to amplify inequalities. They create policies that do not provide access to education that can be converted into dignified jobs. There's a lack of access to well-paid jobs, to dignified jobs that people would make people want to stay. They don't create policies or conditions for healthcare to become accessible to the majority. Excuse me. And these conditions are also worsened by natural disasters related to climate change very often. And I am focusing on the contemporary period, but I want you to also think about these conditions expanding over decades, over periods of time in which migratory flows are created. So, for instance, in the case of Central America, very often children, women, and men often see no future. We interviewed Hondurans who had been deported from the United States in Honduras. And a man told us that after having been deported twice, he was still contemplating migration to the United States because he saw no future in his country. And he was contemplating to do this at the risk of incarceration, not only of another deportation, but also of imprisonment in the United States after having been deported. And a Guatemalan woman during my ethnographic project that I conducted in Guatemala was sharing with me her plans for migrating to the United States. I mentioned to her that conditions for women are particularly dangerous during the trip, and that many are killed or disappear for quite a bit because of the condition of being women. And she posed a question to me and said, what do you think is better then for me to die in my country little by little because I'm going to eventually die of hunger here, or die all at once during the journey? And to me, that highlights the very, very limited options that people see in their lives and that create these large population movements from that region. It would be incorrect to focus only on the sending state when I mention the sending state, because the role of the wealthy receiving state is very present in the sending context. In this case, for instance, the sending countries don't create those conditions alone, independent of the wealthy countries. For instance, we see the role of European powers historically in the Middle East that have later on created major exodus in the region. In the case of Central America, we see the role of the United States through market expansions, multinationals, creations of dependent economies, military interventions, and dislocations that contribute to creating the conditions that make people want to migrate. In this, I would like to refer to Saskia Sassen's observation that migratory flows do not just happen; they are produced, and migrations don't involve just any possible combination of countries. They're not random; they're very patterned. The migrants tend to go to the countries that are the centers of regional power, and who have played a historical role in that they seek to lead. In addition to what I just mentioned, although the sending countries very often are militarized, securitized, they still do not protect most people from violence. They are either unable or unwilling or both. And very often, agents of the state participate directly in the violence that makes people want to migrate. My work on gender-based violence makes this quite clear, as the sending states in Central America mostly are unwilling to protect women and girls from violence. For instance, the UNHCR conducted a survey of women who had left Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and were seeking asylum in the United States. And 60% of them reported attacks, sexual assaults, rapes, they also reported not receiving any protection, not even expecting any protection from the authorities there. So I want to highlight what the sending states do, but also the role of the wealthy receiving state in the sending area as well. So to complicate things a little bit, it's not just black and white. And the role of the transit countries that have served as buffer spaces and strategies of remote control. We have seen the expansion of borders internally and externally. The insourcing or internalization of borders through more enforcement, interior enforcement of control, of immigration control, and at the same time, the externalization of or outsourcing of borders beyond the physical territory of the receiving state. Excuse me, we see, for instance, state policies of remote control that wealthy nations use to control migration. For instance, legal maneuvers, pressure, foreign aid, withholding, that again, David Fitzgerald documented work. The case of Australia's use of islands, of its slices of its own territory to restrict the rights of asylum seekers is another example, as well as Mexico becoming a vertical southern border that expands and expands and continues to expand to encompass Guatemala and El Salvador in order to keep more and more migrants coming from countries further south to keep them from arriving even to the borders of the United States. And we see these not only in the case that I'm talking about in Central America or in relation to the United States and Mexico as a migration corridor, but we see these. You can think, I'm sure, of other cases where this also happens. There are many parallels around the world with North Africa, the eastern part of Europe, and etc. There too, the receiving state, the US, in the case that I'm examining for Central America, plays a major role in the outsourcing of borders throughout the transit territories. Wealthy nations engage transit countries in their immigration control, shifting control of the spaces outside the territorial borders by providing financial and military support or withholding development aid, sharing technological innovations and surveillance systems, and creating similar systems of enforcement that they have already, for instance, in the United States, replicating those in the transit countries as well. In Mexico, for instance, in Guatemala, all those countries have major security apparatus to control migration through their territories, including the creation of a border patrol in El Salvador, for instance. So I just wanted to highlight that. And the consequence of this is that violence flourishes across all these migration corridors, calling for even more securitization, calling for even more militarized response. And so this violence, of course, affects not only the migrants themselves, but everyone who lives in those corridors, non-migrants as well. So we see a spiral of violence throughout the migration corridors, and you can again think of other parallels around the world as I talk about Central America here. The receiving state and the bureaucracies that receive or very often repel or try to block immigrants from coming in there are many ways for this manifestation, but we probably are more familiar with border security and enforcement to allow in as few people as practicable and possible. But we also have that's probably the more visible, the more salient expressions of state power on the part of the receiving countries. But we also have the less visible, but very often quite powerful mechanism, and that is the classificatory power of the state to place immigrants, documented, undocumented, in between, asylum seekers, refugees. It is the state, it is state power that classifies those who are coming into all these categories. And each of these categories has varying degrees of rights for those who are either let in, held in between, held in detention, or classified as undocumented and yeah. And also, it is a less visible manifestation of state power at the receiving end is seen in the framing of immigration spike or immigration flows of immigration that sometimes increase, framing them as crisis, because the framing of crisis is a very interesting political maneuver that justifies more enforcement and a very often more militarized response to the migrants and the asylum seekers coming in seeking protection. But because I want to also emphasize, and I'm going to end shortly, that because I want to also highlight that the state is not a homogeneous entity, I want to call your attention to how different agencies of the same state may work at cross purposes and have a different effects on people seeking protection or people who are migrating, but also how state agencies work in collaboration with non-state actors to involve and embed more and more actors working on behalf of the state. So I'm going to share one case, the case of unaccompanied migrant children in Central America. I wanted to share the work of Caragalli here, who has studied how unaccompanied migrant children from Central America are received by bureaucracies of the US government. On the one hand, they are children, and on the other hand, they are undocumented. So as undocumented immigrants, they are subjected to enforcement, but as children, they are considered in need of protection. What this does is it leads to a combination for the children, a combination of trust in state protection as children. They see hope in that, but at the same time, they fear the punishing, the punitive side of the state because they are undocumented and they fear deportation. So this brings that tension that I mentioned earlier into in this case. And the work of Humphreys and Nando Sigona in the UK, also with unaccompanied migrant children, highlights what happens when the state involves non-state actors in the work of the state. The state, as the states receive unaccompanied migrant children, they seek the best interest of the child as a principle. But they also, they also involve the for-profit sector, which is happening around the world as well. And cost savings undermines the capacity of agencies to work, and this results in the misplacement of expertise in this area. So again, bringing in non-state actors to do the work, to expand the work of the state, sometimes results in the undermining of the goal of protecting the end promoting the best interest of the child. So what can we say about the role of the state in all this? In the case of migration, multiple manifestations through various agencies, sometimes conflicting, sometimes operating in unison, sometimes involving non-state actors. This is a very fluid, very dynamic image that I want you to retain. States, sending, receiving, transit, all working in collaboration, create, sustain, control migratory flows through the collaboration and expansive technologies of surveillance and through other means. To me, this highlights the complexity of state actors because it shows the regulatory power, the punitive power, but also the protector and guarantee, also the state as a protector and guarantor of rights, because don't forget that many asylum seekers are seeking protection in the receiving countries they go to. So their migration, this migration crisis that we see around the world, highlight the multiple goals and the multiple forms the state takes in their lives as regulatory, punitive, and guarantor of rights. End to end, what is possible? What can be done? And in my work, I have seen the role of non-state actors being central. For instance, in my work on gender-based violence and on migration, non-state actors can make a difference. And two non-state actors I want to mention are civil society actors, organizations, advocates, and as well as supranational entities, international organizations. And what I have seen is when they work in coordination, they seem to produce results that will, in the end, protect the rights and lives of many people, but not always. And so I want to end here because I think hope I haven't gone over my time. So thank you very much. I will end here.
Thank you, Cecilia, for taking us through the history and challenges of one of the most difficult world problems. Well, actually, in the first panel, Jared Diamond identified the four impending world problems and crises. One was nuclear crisis, 2, climate change, 3, energy depletion, and 4, inequality. As one of the consequences of inequalities included, according to Jared, international migration. The folks who are living in developing countries and poor countries and learn about what the life is like in the West, in the first world, and aspiring to move to the other countries to look for hope in resettle in the other part of the world. So I think it really touches upon the centrality of international migration. Why should we care about international migration? Not only because it really brings about chaos and conflicts around the borders between the US and Central America, but also as one of the crucial consequences of inequalities we're seeing around the world. Okay, thank you for your insightful lecture. We really appreciate that. I've got some, I heard about some technical glitch about the audio problem. So speakers and discussants might want to get closer to your microphone so that the audience, which is actually over 500 right now, tuned in through YouTube. So that might be one thing you might want to keep in mind when we proceed. All right. Now, Cecilia's delineation of the global migration crisis will be followed by the second talk by Professor Amanda Murdy. Amanda Murdy is a professor of international affairs and chair at the University of Georgia. She is editor-in-chief of International Studies Review and has published over 50 articles and book chapters in such journals as Journal of Politics, British Journal of Political Science, and international organizations. What a remarkable achievement as a scholar who's still very young, I guess. The title for her talk is Hostilities on Civil Society and Growing Human Rights Abuses. Amanda, I'll let you take it from here. It's your turn with 25 to 30 minutes.
Thanks so much for having me here today. Can everyone hear me just fine?
Can you get a little bit closer, Amanda?
Okay, sure. Can you hear me now?
I think we can hear, but the tone is low.
Uh-oh. Okay, can you hear me now? I don't know if I can change much.
All right, great. Here we go. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thanks so much for having me here today. It's been really nice to listen to all this amazing work on the era of upheaval that we're all unfortunately living through. A special thanks to Dr. Koo for calling me young and for his colleagues and he for inviting me. As he said, I'm a political scientist by training, and most of my research is on how we can secure improvements in human rights around the world. Today, I'm going to present some ideas about how this era of upheaval will affect the rights that we all enjoy. Sure, I can change. There we go. Like all of you, I have been very troubled by these changes that we've been talking about today and that we've seen around the world. And especially as the changes in my own country, like Dr. Diamond was talking about. Polarization and nationalism are on the rise, including a rise in far-right extremism. According to data from the Varieties of Democracy Project, 68% of the world's population now lives under an autocratic regime. And that's up from about 40% a decade ago. 34% of countries are currently going through the exact opposite of democratization. They're becoming significantly more autocratic. Coupled with this, we're living in an era where the realities of climate change are known, even if part of the world's population, and especially the population in the US, rejects this reality as fake news. Climate-related environmental disasters are increasing at the same time that we've been hopefully experiencing only a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. This is all extremely exhausting. The question for my talk today is a question that I've been repeatedly asking myself over the past 2 years as I sit in quarantine. With the world on fire and the upheaval that we see around us, what does the future hold for human rights? Is the international human rights regime that we've all seen develop over the past 80 years now a thing of the past? What do these changes mean for global human rights? In reality, what I'm asking is, are we actually doomed? I'm not alone in my concern. Many scholars and activists have also said the same thing. I have a quote here. During the 25th anniversary of the World Conference of Human Rights in Vienna that happened pretty recently, the then UN High Commissioner for Human Rights remarked, and this is a quote, "Human rights are solely under pressure around the world. No longer a priority, they're more like a pariah. The legitimacy of human rights principles are being attacked. The practice of human rights is on the retreat." How do we understand the situation that we all find ourselves in? To summarize my answer today, let me highlight some good news. When we look across the last 50 years, we've actually made tremendous strides in improving human rights around the world. The global civil society movement that Cecilia was talking about, democratization and globalization, these have all led to some really real improvements in human rights. But as we now stand on this precipice with the world on fire and this upheaval that we've seen, we also need to realize that the processes and pathways that may have led to these past successes, along with some exogenous shocks, have contributed to this global situation that may trample our rights and the previous gains and also harm future human rights. In my talk today, I want to provide some basic insights based on current research concerning how this world on fire upheaval that we're seeing could limit future human rights. As scholars, I think it's really important that we build our understanding of these recent phenomenon into something that is linked to our overall understanding of why human rights abuses occur in the first place. My second goal is to call us all to action, both in our academic work and in our personal lives, to protect and strengthen the global human rights regime. Our actions could help limit the impact of this fire that we see around us and provide us some fireproofing to protect against those future infernos. Let me start this discussion with providing a basic working definition of what I mean by human rights. Your human rights pre-exist to the state. They are rights you have simply by being human. They have been enumerated in a number of both domestic and international documents, outlining everything from things like freedom of torture to being free to marry who you want and to enjoy proper rest time. The United Nations General Assembly resolution that created the Human Rights Council stated that all human rights are universal, indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent, and mutually reinforcing, and that all human rights must be treated in a fair and equal manner, with the same footing and the same emphasis. However, in reality, I think most of the focus, for better or for worse, in political science especially, has been on a few non-derogable rights and their protection from the state: freedom from torture, freedom from political killings, imprisonment, and beatings. Now, here's the part of the talk where the security-minded individuals over YouTube or in the room tend to zone out. Especially in our current world on fire situation, it's easy to think of human rights as something pie in the sky, some sort of ideal that we mainly associate with these free-loving, Birkenstock-wearing hippies. But I want to make clear that human rights are a matter of national and international security. We know through over a decade of research that protecting human rights creates and sustains peace. When a country has fewer physical integrity rights abuses, they are less likely to go to war, both internationally and domestically, and less likely to have an insurgency or a terrorist attack within their borders. These results hold even when we control or account for things like a country's general wealth and regime type. Protecting human rights actually matters. And that's good news for all of us. And it's really good news that for us that global human rights have improved in our lifetime. This is a graph of the global mean of Christopher Ferris's human rights scores, which is the current state-of-the-art indicator for capturing physical integrity rights abuses over time. You'll see that up until very recently, like 2018, global human rights had generally been increasing since the 1980s. This is good news for us. Despite the world on fire rhetoric, we're actually in a much better place than our grandparents were in. And as recent research has shown, during the same time, our ability to detect abuses and the complexity with which we talk about human rights has improved. In this current situation, given the importance of human rights, I think it's really critical that we put these recent changes in context and look at how we can protect against future losses to all of this progress we see in this graph. With that in mind, I'm going to first briefly give an overview of the causal processes that current scholars think lead to human rights abuses, and then I'll use this knowledge to build on our understanding of the pathways by which all of these world on fire upheaval changes could actually affect human rights. In general, I think there are about 3 reinforcing ways that we currently think about what causes human rights abuses. First, we can think about human rights as public goods. Like I just told you, human rights have widespread benefits on peace in society that extend across borders. However, like all public goods, human rights suffers from collective action problems. Those that might gain individually from the limited provision of human rights, like leaders using abuses to control a population, may win out against the broader population, who may avoid collective action because the gains from human rights are so diffused. This issue occurs both at the domestic and the international level and is complicated by norms about state sovereignty, which may further stop international actors from demanding that other states improve their human rights for fear that their own free riding and abuses would be put in the spotlight. And according to the second way we commonly think about human rights abuses, there are really like 2 large and somewhat interconnected reasons for why states would violate someone's human rights. The first big category for why governments violate human rights has to do with strategy. Sometimes violating human rights can seem like a short-term solution to a national security threat. Repression is often used when a leader or the government is threatened from protests or challenges against the regime. Even though their actions may backfire and mobilize more people to take to the street against the government, governments will respond with force if they think they are threatened in any way. Second, It might just be that states are incapable. This is a common defense against calls to provide economic, social, or cultural rights, things we often think of as positive rights, like the right to education or healthcare. Capacity, though, might also come in with other rights, like the ones we think about as negative rights or freedoms from something. This would be things like the freedom from torture or political killing. It could be that government agents, like police or security forces, are not actually trained or monitored. And it's this incapacity that leads to abuses. By improving monitoring capacity for police and military agents, and by bolstering the judicial system, which could hold them accountable for their abuses, we are able to protect against human rights abuses that might not actually be part of a regime's strategy, but are mainly a principal agent problem, with rogue agents harming human rights for their own personal preferences. In line with this logic, all of this logic, in order to get states to stop violating human rights, we need to force leaders and their agents to rethink the expected utility of abuses. We need to convince actors that human rights abuses are not appropriate responses to threat, either because they're morally or ethically inappropriate, or because such abuses are ineffective and could have negative consequences. This logic all helps explain what researchers have found to be the biggest cross-national drivers of human rights abuses. We'll call this the third category of explanations for what leads to human rights abuses. These are the cross-national covariates. We find that certain types of regimes, especially unstable or changing ones, often abuse human rights, especially if there's a civil war. Human rights abuses also occur when governments think they can get away with it, when people don't have the resources to push back, or are limited due to the size or development from organizing collectively. If domestic groups don't have the resources to send out messages for assistance from the transnational advocacy network in the international community, or if they lack the ability to overcome collective action problems themselves, that's when human rights abuses will often remain unchecked. These three interrelated causal pathways help us understand how all of these world on fire problems could negatively affect human rights. Let's talk about a few. First, pandemics and disasters reduce capacity, making it harder to control rogue agents and harder to organize collective action for improved human rights. Pandemics and disasters also harm development and citizen capacity, giving leaders an opening to use human rights abuses as a way to consolidate their hold on power. Inequality has a similar effect on human rights. It can create unrest between segments of the population, limiting the possibility of collective action against abuses and providing an excuse for more abuse as a way to quell unrest. Globally, we're seeing an increase in new forms of nationalism and isolationism, which also harms human rights. New restrictions on protest and repression of minorities in some states in the global north, especially in the United States, have contributed to the erosion of credibility that the West had in the promotion of human rights. As a result, very few governments can be seen as champions for human rights today. All of this has come at roughly the same time that public opinion towards the United Nations and other intergovernmental organizations has declined in certain regions and among certain political ideologies. These changes have led to a backlash against outside human rights advocacy, limiting the ability of advocates to build collective action and eroding the credibility of any soft power attempts to improve human rights. Finally, I think there's actually been some innovations in the past few decades to further limit collective action for improved human rights. Growing restrictions to civil society, especially foreign-led civil society, may be part of this backlash against the hypocrisy that we've seen in the global north. However, closing civil society space is also a harbinger of further human rights abuses, creating a situation where leaders don't have to fear using human rights abuses as part of a strategy for political control. The same has been found with the killing of journalists, which are often called the canary in the coal mine for future abuses. When journalists are killed, others speaking out against abuses may be silenced, limiting the ability for collective anger and action to grow. In sum, all of this world on fire stuff that we've seen in the last few years of upheaval harms the ability of human rights to take hold, in part because it makes collective action harder and allows political leaders to use abuses as a way to attempt to control the population. And given changing power dynamics, nationalism and isolationism outside countries have become unable or unwilling to help create the collective action pressure that could counter abuses. I do want to highlight one positive idea, however. Some of these World on Fire events may be the unintended consequences or externalities of processes that we do know have improved human rights. Democratization and globalization have been net positives for human rights over the years. This is not to downplay these current events, but just to highlight that some of these changes may be short-term externalities that are part of longer-term positives that haven't been altogether that problematic for human rights. If we can protect against future erosion, we might be able to limit our losses. And this brings me to the last big question for today. Given our current understanding of why human rights abuses occur and how these World on Fire upheaval events of the last few years factor into this understanding, what can we all do to support human rights in this difficult time? Let me offer 5 tentative ideas that I'm going to be focusing on in my own work in the next few years. First, I think we need more serious research on human rights opinions. Previously, if human rights scholarship looked at popular will, it often assumed that the average person was supportive of human rights ideals, especially ideals related to basic human rights like bodily integrity. The focus in the scholarship was often not on convincing individuals that human rights are important, but on convincing powerful elites to share power or allocate resources to improve human rights, and then to mobilize an already supportive population to get off of their couch and participate in collective action. Unfortunately, in this era of populism and nationalistic backlash, the fallacy of this assumption has become clear. Solidarity around human rights ideals can vary, and a lack of solidarity may undermine advocacy attempts before they even start. We can no longer assume that the average person supports improved human rights. When the cost of human rights improvement are presented at coming at the expense of security, economic rights, or mobility, citizens in many countries around the world have shown little willingness to support even basic human rights. What this current era of backlash politics shows us is that we can't assume that human rights are supported by the general population. If individuals are not supportive, this is a major impediment to collective action. Understanding when and where people do not support human rights for others in their own country or for others around the world could help us understand this implementation gap that we currently have, where there are well-enumerated international standards for human rights practices, but a lack of human rights domestically. A better understanding of how everyday individuals are motivated to act for human rights or to act to support abuses would be paramount for improved collective action. Many innovative scholars are already using surveys and survey experiments to examine how specific characteristics affect individual level support for human rights. This is work by Dr. Ku, especially for things like freedom from torture. Future work in this vein needs to extend to other human rights and examine the way in which the potential cost for the full enjoyment of human rights could influence public willingness to act in support of certain human rights policies. Second, if we want to have any diplomatic leverage ourselves in calling for the protection of civil society freedoms and other human rights abroad, we have to make sure that our liberties are not dwindling in our own backyards. I know many academics are hesitant of personal advocacy. However, I think our leverage on this issue abroad could go away entirely if we do not speak out when we see human rights, when we see our human rights and the human rights of our neighbors restricted at home. Supporting our own local human rights organizations through our own advocacy or research is part of how we protect the global human rights regime. Third, I mentioned that part of this World on Fire problem is the growing attacks against civil society activists and journalists that we're seeing. Understanding the role of these attacks in broader backsliding efforts is important. Some regimes have tried to justify restrictions to civil society as a new way to curb terrorism. New research by Dr. Ku and myself show that this just isn't true. We need to get the word out that restrictions to civil society, even if it's taken in the name of security, could be incredibly harmful for human rights generally, and may even lead to more terrorism or political violence. Journalists and NGO workers are needed for peace. Fourth, we need to protect and defend the existing human rights regime and be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. While no institution is perfect, we have good evidence that national human rights institutions improve human rights, even when we account for the factors that led to their creation in the first place. Further, concerns about the ineffectiveness of international human rights institutions are completely overstated. While there was some early work that showed limited impacts of human rights treaties on a country's human rights, more recent work has repeatedly shown that human rights treaties lead to improvements in human rights. We can advocate for improved institutions and procedures without throwing out our hard-won existing treaties. Finally, human rights education does not need to be something that is left for the college elective. There's a lot of excellent research that shows how human rights education can be a critical part of many social science, history, or civics education courses across the lifespan. To me, this seems to be a critical link in ensuring mobilization when lives are on the line. In short, absolutely, the world is on fire. It's a troubling time, and many of the changes we see can be easily incorporated into pathways which we know harm human rights. In order to protect against future losses, we need to understand these pathways, work to reinforce current structures, and reiterate the ways in which human rights are critical to world peace and prosperity. Human rights are a public good, and like all public goods, when rights are undersupplied somewhere, it hurts all of us. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Amanda, for your insightful lecture. And I mean, you actually mentioned about the two things. On one hand, the world is on fire. Two is that human rights are improving remarkably if you take into account the data, science, the evidence, and talking about the ways in which we can make our world better by better respecting human rights and better implementing human rights. Thanks for your talk again. Now, let me introduce the first commentator, Professor Emily Yu. Emily Yu is a professor of law at the USC Gould School of Law. She served as a law clerk to the Honorable Margaret McQuan of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and practiced law at an international law firm. Emily, floor is yours, and you've got about 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here with you all, and really honored actually to be in the good company of such amazing scholars on this panel whom I so admire. And of course, special thank you to Jung-Woo for making all of this possible. I'm a sociologist and a lawyer by training. So my perspectives are typically interdisciplinary in nature, and substantively, a lot of my work focuses on the intersection between immigration law and criminal law, particularly as it in topics related to immigration enforcement. In terms of the job that Jung-Woo has tasked me with as a commentator, he asked that we contemplate the forest and not the trees, so to speak. But I should say, as a researcher, I actually like thinking about trees a lot that make up the forest. But in any event, what I'd like to do is, for the next 9 minutes or so, is to focus my comments on three big themes that I think are common across Amanda's and Cecilia's remarks that have helped me to organize my thinking on these really important topics. But let me just actually preface what I'm about to say with one observation, which is, I have to confess that as much as I loved and appreciated hearing both Amanda and Cecilia's remarks for their, really deep insights on the nature and the impact of various upheavals on human rights and global migration, it's in some ways really overwhelming to think about all of these many different crises at the same time and quote unquote crises at the same time, and how the world just seems now to be constantly on fire in all sorts of ways, right? Makes me feel like the problems are just too big and too vast to even try to process, let alone try to confront and try to find solutions for. And actually, I feel this way despite Amanda's reminders that we saw on our PowerPoint to keep calm and to carry on, or to keep calm and to do science, right? which are both really comforting and useful mottos, at least for me, that can guide our action nowadays. So I thought I would focus on just one of the upheavals that all of us have been experiencing just so viscerally in the past couple of years, the pandemic, as a lens through which we can think about the ways in which upheavals can bring about positive change, hopefully. More specifically, I'm going to suggest that the pandemic has taught us 3 big lessons that have important implications for thinking about what both Amanda and Cecilia talked about in terms of human rights and global migration. So the first lesson that the pandemic has taught us is that no one will be safe until everyone is safe, right? Meaning, we can vaccinate all we want or get boosted all we want, but the virus doesn't care about territorial boundaries. I think we've learned over and over in a really painful way that what happens in countries that do not have easy access to the vaccine, will end up impacting all of us, right? And that it's short-sighted and foolish to think of countries as being these sort of bounded entities. And that idea of global connectedness, I think, is so important in both Amanda and Cecilia's talks. So Amanda, reminded us that improved human rights conditions within a given country can lead to widespread and reinforcing benefits, not just for that country, but other countries as well, by reducing the likelihood of things like international wars, of transnational terrorism. And Cecilia reminds us that it's wrong to focus only on the conditions that sending states create, because those conditions are produced not just by those sending countries, but through all kinds of interventions and actions that are taken by the wealthier receiving countries. Cecilia also argued that militarized approaches to border enforcement are dangerous, not just for the migrants, but also for non-migrants living in those areas as well. And along the same vein, in my own work on immigration detention in the United States, I've argued that when we detain and deport migrants without due process, we're not only returning people to their various origin countries, but we're also, exporting all kinds of legal cynicism and distrust of the rule of law beyond our borders. And that has real implications for global governance and democracy all over the world. So I think one important research task is to figure out how to harness that knowledge to improve human rights and to protect migrants' rights. The idea that harm that falls on the most vulnerable among us is harm that ultimately impacts all of us, because we all live in the same planet and are responsible for each other and to each other. I think that it's easy to acknowledge that in theory, but hard to embrace that in practice when policy decisions are being made. So I'd argue for research that tells us how to address that problem of making salient the interconnectedness of our communities across borders when policy decisions are being made. The second important lesson that the pandemic has taught us, I would argue, that I think also resonates deeply in the context of thinking about human rights and international migration, is that important changes often come from bottom up, not top down, which seems kind of counter to what we, think we understand about the pandemic, which is this prevailing narrative that these governments took control, they instituted all these policies almost overnight that drastically changed all our lives. But what the pandemic has also shown us, I think, is that people going through these kinds of sudden external shocks to the system and living through extraordinary challenges that we have never experienced before, we're forced to reconsider our priorities and core beliefs. And that process of reassessing and reevaluating our values, I think, can, reorient what we demand of our governments, I think. So Cecilia has focused her talk on the importance of state actors, but she also touched on the role of non-state actors on the ground. And Amanda highlighted the importance of understanding people's attitudes toward human rights, right? What factors influence their opinions? What leads to backlash? And I think we need to be more committed to doing that kind of research too in the context of international migration and protection of migrant rights. So for example, in 2018, when President Trump instituted a policy at the southern border that separated migrant children from their undocumented parents who were apprehended at our border, there was an enormous wave of public outcry and criticism of that policy. And during that summer, I visited some of these facilities that held migrant children and was able to take their affidavits in support of an ongoing class action litigation that was seeking to release them, and if not, to hold the government accountable so they could provide certain basic conditions of care for the children. And it was hard to get into these facilities, even as a lawyer. And so I was actually surprised in some ways that members of the public who don't generally have, might not have any interest in immigration usually, and for whom immigration is normally not that salient of an issue, and of course have never even met these children, were so galvanized and so mobilized in unprecedented ways on behalf of these children. But sadly, we don't really hear much about the children anymore, and the public has moved on, so to speak. So I think one challenge in understanding public opinion in terms of its impact on human rights and protection of migrants is to investigate whether and to what extent these, public opinions remain stable and durable over time, and why, and if not, why not? And also what happens to those beliefs and values when crises like pandemic come along, right? To either make us feel more fearful and insular, or more generous and open to new communities, as some polls seem to be indicating in terms of the impact of the pandemic, at least in the United States. The third and final lesson that I'll highlight from the pandemic that I think has deep implications for human rights and the protection of migrants is the importance of technology. So Cecilia mentioned a little bit about the growing importance of technological innovations and surveillance systems that are in place in terms of border security and immigration enforcement. But there's also some really exciting research that's happening by scholars like Katerina Linos at Berkeley Law, who has looked at, among individuals who are seeking refugee status, how misinformation and rumors are created and propagated, and how they impede those refugees' ability to claim basic human rights. And one practical aspect of that kind of research is shining a light on how new technologies like the use of mobile phone apps can be used to close those kinds of communication gaps. And I think the pandemic, we all agree, has really laid bare for all of us in a very stark and startling way how lack of access to technology can leave entire communities behind in a world where now almost everything has to operate virtually, right? And that underlying inequality then has led to further compounding inequalities in all aspects of life, I think, for disadvantaged groups. For example, our work, our school, our ability to access healthcare, our ability to attend court hearings or engage in electronic fund transfers of our money, so on. All of these activities that we take for granted because we can just hop online, became impossible for many people who lack access to technology. For example, the pandemic has had a major impact on remittances of migrants, the money that they send back home to their countries of origin. And the World Bank actually projects that remittances sent back home to low and middle income countries may see as high as a $78 billion decline, which is about 14% of the total amount as a result of the pandemic. And as you can imagine, just that, what kind of a negative impact that might have on the livelihoods of millions of migrants and their families, right? So I think an important question for the next frontier research that I love to engage in, as well as other scholars, I hope will do the same, is about trying to understand how and to what extent technology, use of it, uneven distribution of it, overuse of it, can generate deep inequalities that can undermine human rights, as well as shape global migration and protection of immigrant rights. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Emily. You focused on three things. One is about the global interconnectedness. Two, the need to reevaluate our value system. Three, the increasing salience of technology, with a more cautious warning about access to technology. These are highly relevant to the topic we're grappling with today. Thank you, Emily, again. The second commentator following Emily is Professor Won-bin Cho, representing 성균관 University. He's a professor of political science at 성균관 University. Prior to joining 성균관, he taught at the University of Kentucky. He's a widely recognized researcher specializing in African politics. Won-bin, please go ahead. You've got 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. And Sorry, I should turn off my microphone. Hello, this is Won Bin-jo, and first of all, I'm very honored to be here, and I see a lot of the big shots, and then also many scholars who are interested in the human rights and migrations. Actually, as the Jung-woo introduced me, I'm studying the African politics, more focusing on democracy and democratizations. And after moving back to South Korea, and I'm also focusing on the relationship between the China and Africa. So, and first of all, I've really learned a lot from today's lectures and discussions about human rights and migrations. And even so, those fields are not my focus field, but because I'm studying African politics, and also I'm right now living in the Eastern Asia. Actually, both of you presenters are more familiar with maybe the American continent, like North America and Central America, and then maybe European. You mentioned sometimes Africa and Middle East, but never mentioned about East Asian. I mean, Southeast Asia, the immigration issue is quite salient, but as maybe you know that right now in East Asia, like South Korea and Japan and China, there is not much about talking about the migration policies. And actually, this event, this international conference event, actually bring the salient issue to, not only 성균관 University, but also the East Asian communities. What make it very important issues around the world. And unfortunately, maybe you guys studying about migration policies, the South Korea and Japan is, one of the most restrictive policy toward the migrations. And so actually that means, public does not much care about those migrations. I mean, frankly to say, right now in South Korea, there's different issues like, so we are located the Korean Peninsula and we're facing the North Korea. And because of the pandemic, those North Korean defectors, the number of the North Korean defectors is shrinking, almost zero. But before the pandemic, actually, we see in the South Korea, we have a lot of the North Korean defectors. I don't know whether you understand or not, but in China, you can see significant number of the North Korean defectors living there. And so those issues are more salient contextually in East Asia. So through this conversation, maybe this context is more familiar to the 성균관 University students or the Korean peoples, and dealing with these issues, I'd like to focusing on, I totally agree with you, both the Cecilia and Amanda, you mentioned about the state capacity and how the role of state, both the receiving and sending states is important. And in East Asian context, I don't know, you are familiar with North Korea, and I know that China has a pretty strong capacity in terms of the state capacities, but North Korea, still is scholars who studying the North Korea, there is not consensus whether, because many Western scholars think North Korea is a failed state, but some scholars in East Asia know the North Korean state also pretty strong. The capacity is relatively strong. However, applying your, the state capacity, do you think it is still, applicable, the argument, role of the state in terms of the human rights and the migration policies? I think you can explain, even though both, unlike the Latin Americas and Sub-Saharan Africas, we agree that those areas, the state has a low level of the state capacity. Because of that, I think, you can see a lot of the, migrants and human rights abuse we observe. However, in East Asia, like North Korea and China, still this is a very critical issue because the relationship between China and United States, human rights issue is pretty critical, even though both countries have resources, maybe not in the case for the North Korea, but they have a high level of the state capacity, but still, they don't much care about human rights based on, and so, how this, state roles in terms of the, human rights is contextually a little bit different from, those contexts in East Asia is different from the rest of the world. That I'd like to emphasizing it. And also in East Asia, because I'm also studying the public opinion, I totally agree with that. Amanda, you mentioned about the public opinion is very important about human rights. And also, I also agree with that the education also important. And South Korean people, so typically South Korean students, I'm teaching right now, and they are getting better. They are understanding the importance of human rights. But because I have been teaching in the United States for a while, so I can see the level of understanding of the human rights issues still, even though the Korean students are getting better, but, their level of understanding is a little bit, relatively lower than the American students. But what I'm saying is the education is very important to recognize the importance of human rights. And also the public opinions, I would like to bring this issue because, I conducted some survey for the South Korean peoples and then their attitude toward North Korean defectors. And one of their main concern is their economic conditions. They think if we have, a lot of the North Korean defectors, maybe they can replace their job and the South Koreans' jobs. And so job security is one of the concerns when they make their attitude toward North Korean defectors. So it shows that those economic conditions in the, receiving states and sending states is very important. And both of you mentioned a little bit, but I think that is a very important issue for the human rights and immigration issue in general. And I would like to emphasize that. And I totally agree with Emily, because right now we are facing the technological revolutions and the AI, or right now, even before the AI, I think the cell phones and SNS, because of this, the technological development actually make more immigrants. I think, how people living in far away from the United States, those still living in Guatemala and also maybe Peru, how they knows about the Biden administration's foreign policy change. I think this technology actually help those issues globalized and people knows about the conditions of those receiving states and etc. And also they also help the technology development help organizing those groups. So I think this technology also has having a very important impact on those migration issues as well as the human rights issues, because those issues like as you know, in China, the Uyghur issues has been globalized. I think part of the cause is technological development. So I think this technological development actually help the human rights issues is more salient. So I think, as time goes on, I think the globalized human rights issue has been globalized, and then right now we are facing a little bit, crisis. But I think, because of those educations and those recognitions, and also have a positive impact of improving those human rights. Okay, thank you for the listening.
Thank you so much, Wonbin. Very enlightening discussion about many dimensions, including the relevancy to the North Korean issues and issues on the Korean peninsula. I mean, the states with the power and capacity, but with the lack of the will, that's a problem, actually. They've got a lot of power and influences, and they've got all the tools in place to repress people, and without any kind of acknowledgement about the universal human rights values. Okay, so now let me invite the two speakers, Cecilia and Amanda, sorry, to respond to the comments from Emily and Wonbin. Who wants to go first? Cecilia, do you want to go first?
Thank you so much for the very thoughtful comments. And I kept on writing notes because everything was so rich and thought-provoking. So yes, no, I agree with Emily's 3 points that she made about, for instance, research that is needed on technology. Technology is central for everything, starting from the intersection of technology and state power, for instance, but also the various other forms of technology that Emily was talking about, phone apps and social media platforms and chats that migrants use to communicate, that communicate information, but also misinformation. And so I think the attention to technology as it intersects with different aspects, for me, for instance, in the case of migration, but also in the case of violence, especially gender-based violence against women, is very key. So thank you, Emily, for getting light on this one thing that I mentioned very quickly, but that you expanded on along the lines that I think present very rich avenues for research in general. I'm going to stop there because I don't want to take all the time, and I know Amanda probably wants to respond.
Sure. Thanks so much. Both commenters there were just fantastic, and I wrote lots of different things down. I would echo that technology is such an interesting thing because we have to think about things like the right to the internet, which is now considered a human right. We also have to think how technology can be used to both control or abuse a population, but also be used to crowdsource information or to, for example, Amnesty International has done a lot with satellite images to capture abuses that are going on the ground. Professor Wongbin, I really enjoyed these comments as well. The idea of state capacity and thinking about state capacity in different ways has always been really fascinating for me, especially when we think about state capacity as really just an issue of principal agent control. Can the principal, the state, make sure that its bureaucrats stayed under control? And in that regards, North Korea has a lot of state capacity, I would say, which is pretty interesting. I also like what was said about public opinion and the importance of looking at public opinion about an outgroup like a migrant population. Then the other thing I think is so important is when we talk about human rights and other public goods, like I think human rights is, we have to talk about how they affect the private goods. And so we have to think about public goods in relation to what is it actually going to cost me? And I think that was something that you raised that was so important. What is this going to cost me if we give migrants rights and we actually pay them a living wage and everything? Is that going to hurt my job opportunities? So I think those are really important questions for future research, regardless of whether we're in an age of upheaval or not. So thank you both so much.
Thank you so much. I have a question that goes to all the participants since Wonbin talked about the fact that people tend not to be so much interested in migration issues and refugee issues. People tend to be more self-centered. You might, I don't know if we can use the term notion of self-centeredness, which is often used in psychology, but what's for sure to us during the pandemic crisis and COVID pandemic, we've noticed that people are really caring about themselves and their own interests rather than caring about other people. And vaccine nationalism is one of the indicators we can count on to think about how people view other people, how people view other countries, things like that. So one of the good examples might be that occurred in 2018 in South Korea, when we accepted about 561 Yemeni refugees that arrived in South Korea, the island, Jeju Island. And in response, South Korean people, even though they are educated, they took classes on human rights and they know about the basic rights applicable to those Yemeni refugees. But on the other hand, a lot of South Korean citizens and people decried and they panicked about the fluctuation of the coming in of those Yemeni refugees. So my question is, what are the ways in which we could persuade citizens and the people who might be worried about refugees, especially considering the fact that refugees came from Yemen, like Islamic country, in which they often repress women's rights. Coincidentally, the influx of Yemeni refugees occurred when we celebrated the spread of Me Too movement, especially women and people, mothers, people with families. They were concerned about influx of refugees because of the fact, partly because they wouldn't respect women's rights that began to be respected and concerned by the South Korean people. My question again, how can we persuade the public and citizens about refugee rights and universal human rights? That goes to all the participants. Who wants to start? Emily, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I think the question you raised about self-centeredness is really interesting because, at least in the context of the United States, a lot of the quote unquote essential workers who continued to work through the pandemic were immigrants and continue to be immigrants. So the impact on migrant communities have been really disproportionate, at least in the United States. And so from that perspective, the idea that people are, very much insular and focused on sort of sustaining themselves and very much focused on their own self-interest, I think is really counter to the reality and disregarding of the reality that the people who have made our lives possible, right, through the pandemic are these migrants who continue to work. In terms of the question about, whether or not we've become sort of much less sort of internationalist in outlook, I guess, I think that's true. And it's sadly sort of less international in outlook. Well, I would say we become more international outlook, but in negative ways. And I say that because we saw a particular kind of rise in hate crimes against minority communities and minority group members through the pandemic. And in some ways, the pandemic has really made us sort of much more aware of in-group, out-group differences in ways that I think is very harmful to the idea that I've sort of tried to emphasize in my talk as what should pull us all together, right? The idea that what impacts some of the most vulnerable in our communities is something that will impact all of us, right? The interconnectedness. And so I don't have any answers to how we sort of counter those kinds of trends that we've been seeing during the pandemic. But I think there are definitely sort of these issues that are at tension that we need to think a little bit more carefully about.
Thank you, Emily. Quickly, do you want to add to it, Amanda?
I do, and it's not my own work, but I want to make reference to Anna Brashik at Michigan State, BRACIC. She has a new book called Breaking the Exclusion Cycle. And in it, she talks about when you have a small minority group and a larger majority group, that it's really important to have those little by little interactions, and that those can help build trust, and that trust is what gets you, I guess, past that self-centeredness. And she has this all based on experimental work using the Roma population. And it's just a fascinating look. So I would think that might be important for all of us to look at as we think about these issues. And it goes back to things in the first session about how difficult it is to build that community when we're living in isolated spaces and we're so self-segregated. So really difficult questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Emily and Amanda. Don't go away and stay tuned, since we have the other set of extremely interesting panels on AI revolution and social innovation and the role of nonprofit sector in the afternoon. Thank you, Cecilia, Amanda, Emily, and Wanbin.